Hello again, everybody, and welcome to 50 by 50, whatever happened to the Harvard class of 1976. I'm Michael Conniff. I'll be your host for this podcast. I'm also guilty of being a member of this class, but proud to call myself a member of the class of 76. We just had a reunion, and we've had some reaction to the podcast. I want to welcome today two terrific journalists, Bob Garrett and Nick Lemann. Welcome to you both.
Thank you.
Thanks for being here. And I'm actually going to rely on Bob Garrett for this segment. We're going to do something differently. Rather than just talk about how great we are and how much we learned at Harvard, we're actually going to talk about some ideas. And Bob, you were sparked by, I think, one of the podcasts with Elizabeth Vail. So I thought I'd throw it to you and sort of ask you to explain what kind of caught your interest and your eye when it came to that conversation.
Yeah, Mike, thanks for having me. Toward the end of your conversation, and I think she was Elizabeth Schaefer in Mather House, but I didn't know her very well, and I was really excited to learn about all the stuff she had done in her life. But you and she were sort of looking back at what could we have done to have averted somehow this great polarization and political divide we have in this country. And you all talked a little I think about the economic changes in our lifetime, which have been staggering and have left a lot of people feeling angry and distrustful of elites. And it just struck a bell because Nick and I had been swapping some emails about one aspect of that alienation, and that had to do with religion and sort of a pretty widespread abandonment of religion by well-educated elites in our lifetimes and even before.
So all three of us are journalists. Bob most recently has been in Texas, covering the State House for initially, I think it was the Austin newspaper and then the Dallas paper. Is that right, Bob?
Actually, initially it was for the no longer existing Dallas paper, the Times Herald, back in the late 70s. And then I came back about 25 years ago almost to work for what had been the newspaper I'd wanted to put out of business, the Dallas Morning News. And I never worked for the Austin paper, but I've been in Austin because my wife, who grew up in West Texas, didn't want to live in Dallas. She had gone to UT Austin, so Austin was the only acceptable place for us to live.
And in between, you had a similar role in Kentucky, right?
That's right, yeah, and a brief role in California back in the early 2000s.
Now, Nick, by way of introduction, you are the former dean of the Columbia University's Graduate School of Journalism, which is quite a thing to tick on, quite a box to tick on a resume. That's really incredible. But you're also a widely read and renowned author. I've seen you many times in the New Yorker. You have many books out that kind of, I think, deal with some of the things we want to talk about today.
Yeah, definitely.
And I am what I am. I'm a former journalist. I ask a lot of questions. So what struck me about what Elizabeth Vail said, and remember, she works still with Elizabeth Warren, worked in economic development as the business liaison for Barack Obama, and had a big role in Bill Bradley's presidential campaign. And we were sort of talking about, so we are the liberal elite, are we not? We are the mainstream media. All of us have worked, in kind of major outlets. And my question is sort of a starting point. I'll start with you, Nick, is what went wrong, and could we very broadly have done anything different to change where we have arrived at today?
Yes, I think. So now there's the question of how powerful would the members of the class of 76 have been to move the ocean liner? That's a separate. But
Yeah.
um, I'll mention a few things. But let's talk about our class. So I have, you know, memory is can be a little problematic at our age. Um, I have a memory that we were greeted when we arrived at Harvard in Sanders Theater by Daniel Patrick Moynihan,
Oh yeah,
then
I remember it
then a
well.
professor
Yeah.
and later a U.S. senator, somebody I covered a lot as a journalist later.
Oh,
He loved to make these pronunciamentos, and I remember him saying something like, to this group of 18-year-olds, this is the most talented group of people ever assembled in one room in history, or something like that. I don't know
I
if you
remember
remember
that
something like
part.
that, but it was this very, so congratulatory to us. And I think that was about kind of the idea that America had recently created, quote, a meritocracy. And via SAT scores and things like that, and nationalizing Harvard admissions, places like Harvard. And so there was this process in which, in the old days, a sort of New England aristocrats and people like that populated places like Harvard, and then the places like Harvard led you to. But now it would be people from all over the country, from all circumstances, picked purely on the merit, and then they would go on to staff these institutions. And it was assumed that because, I mean, every step of this that I'm saying is questionable, but I'm just saying what the assumption was. It was assumed that because these people were meritorious and diverse, that when they took their positions of responsibility, everybody would love them and they would create this kind of liberal paradise.
Mm.
Uh, well, that didn't happen. Um, there's a book, a very weird book that sort of predicts this, called The Rise of the Meritocracy by Michael Young, a British sociologist. It was published in 1958. And, I can go into it if you want, but to me, it was sort of axiomatic that Harvard and places like it had changed, were making a new kind of elite, and the new kind of elite would be much more popular than the old elite had been, and govern more wisely and be more beloved and build a fairer country. So that's the fundamental irony of the last 50 years.
Bob, your thoughts on that?
I have almost no memory of Moynihan's greeting to us, but I came to Harvard probably largely influenced by the fact that I attended my own father's commencement in I believe it was 66, when he got a PhD in religion from Harvard Divinity School, and he was a Southern Baptist minister and professor of theology at seminaries in Fort Worth, Texas, where I was born, and then Louisville, Kentucky, where I grew up. And he and another of our classmate, Johnny Newport, or John Paul Newport, as you all know him, his father and my father had been Baptist seminary colleagues, and they were very disturbed at the secularization and liberalization, I guess, of the Harvard Divinity School and of the larger university under the presidency of Nathan Pusey. And
Who
so
was
one of the
himself considered a religious nut by most of the faculty, by the
That's
way.
right. Well, that gives you an idea of where John and I are coming from. But our fathers got together when we both got in Harvard, and I had, of course, been, I think, smitten as a sixth grader by the pageantry of a Harvard commencement, and I was a kid from the South. Um, and so our fathers, in the summer before we came to hear from Daniel Patrick Moynihan, um, said, "Oh well, we need our boys to stand firm in the faith and buttress one another's faith. So let's get them together as roommates." So the irony of that is our fathers didn't fully appreciate how much 18 years of of very severe sort of religious indoctrination that marked our childhoods. We were going to Harvard for a reason to get away from that. So,
Little did
yeah,
they know.
go
I
ahead.
yeah,
It
I
sort
was
of
going to say,
backfired, is all I'm saying. The plan.
yeah,
But
yeah, apparently. But for the record, I'll tell you what I remember about Daniel Patrick Moynihan's speech. Number one, I hadn't read any of the books, which kind of set the
right,
table for my career as an academic. But number two, there was a kid in one of the front rows smoking cigarettes, and he had. Do you remember this? He had a heart attack. I mean, not literally, but Daniel Patrick Moynihan stopped everything and screamed at the guy and told him, I think he said that Sanders Theater had burned down before once, or I mean, he just ripped him a new one, and then went on with,
I
then went
remember
on with
that
what
part.
you guys remember. But am I the only one who remembers that? That's the,
Yeah, I don't remember that. Another thing I remember though is we were all supposed to read a novel by Lionel Trilling called The Middle of the Journey. And Moynihan says, many literary critics feel this is not really as good as Trilling's literary criticism because he wasn't born to be a novelist. And one kid in the audience, eager young Harvard student already, says, no, I thought it was a great novel. And then Moynihan says, oh, well, thank you. I'll tell Lionel you said that. And what it struck me that, I don't know, I know about Bob, I don't know about you, Michael, but I grew up in a world where the idea that you would personally know the authors of books you were assigned to read was like complete fantasy. So I thought,
Yeah.
wow, I'm in a different world right now.
But Nick, I'm struck by what you were describing. The meritocracy, because weren't you kind of describing um, a non-elitist elite in a sense?
Yes, right.
Saying, right. I think that's what you're driving at. So the question I have for both of you is: were we that group, or were we just another set of elitist Harvard students? I just want to point out one factoid, which is that I was surprised to learn that I think Andover, I might be a little off, but Andover had 45 students, and Exeter had 45 students in their class.
Yeah, I remember it exactly that way.
That's almost 100 students in a class of 1,600 from the two top
Yeah,
elite boarding schools.
absolutely.
So what helped shape that kind of? Were we elite? Were we not elite? Are we elite? What is elite?
Well, there's sort of the supply side, and then there's what do you do later, right? So on the what do you do later, just to start there, you may have the stats. Um, there's a long, long history around what we now call meritocracy, the idea of engineering an elite for a society, going back at least to Plato's Republic, if not before. Um, so, what's notable about our class, I don't want to pick on us, is there's Bob's point that very few are actively religious, but for the most part, these systems, and this goes all the way back to Confucian China, they were developed to grow capable public servants. Well, lots of us have spent our lives in and around politics, but I think almost nobody in our class, I think at our 25th, it was 1% had been career government employees. So, so that's number one. Very, very few have ever served in the military. Uh, my dad did. I don't know about your dads, but that went away. Religion went away. It's a different kind of elite that became what Robert Reich calls symbolic analysts. Many of them, not so much our class, but subsequent classes became, management consultants. They work in finance. They work in tech. As we saw from our class survey, they're doing very, very well financially. So the system gets regarded as not a system to train a public service class, which itself, engenders populist revolt, as we see in places like France, but a sort of place that hands out tickets to get very well off, later in life in the private sector.
So we were not the we did not populate the deep state. That's not that
Yeah,
wasn't.
some did, but it's just perceived as this system is a system for determining, handing out rewards to people,
Hmm.
not breeding people to serve the country and the public. And that changes the valence a lot. And then when you look at on the supply end, what we all wish were true is what I call the diamonds in the rough theory. And this was the theory of James Conant, Harvard president, who kind of even invented the use of SATs and admissions. And that is high intellectual talent is scattered randomly through the country, geographically randomly by class, randomly by parents, etc. Would that were true, but it's not true. Um, Dean David Deming, who spoke to us, had his name on a recent study of Harvard and places like it. And, the percent of people who enroll at these schools who have very high SAT scores, but who come from families in the lower half of the income distribution is like maybe 1%. It's
Hmm.
vanishingly small. So the meritocracy weeds out perhaps like dumb, undeserving rich kids, but
Hmm.
it doesn't exactly fail to reward prosperous background. And so that's another part of the
Hmm.
resentment, I think.
Bob, do you think religion went away?
Well, the latest Pew survey, I think you all probably saw last year, sort of saw sort of an arresting of the steep decline we've seen in recent decades. And, I don't want to get into that because I don't really, I mean, some of it is you've been seeing stories about young men turning to Catholicism. And I know you, Mike, went to Canterbury with our friend John Kiernan, a Catholic boarding school that Sergeant Shriver and other prominent public servants went to. But I wanted to just, I
John F.
thought,
Kennedy, President Kennedy went there. President Kennedy went.
okay,
He
okay.
did not graduate, but he did go.
I thought he went to Choate.
He ended up at Choate, I think, but he left Canterbury as a sick young man. But
Yeah.
he was there for a while. But go
Well, I
ahead,
think
Bob.
what Nick talked about two institutions that helped form solidarity in our parents' generation and the military service and the and religion. I think is a good thing not to leave out that military service. I mean, you and I probably recall that the late Mark Shields, whom I first saw at the JFK Institute of Politics as a freshman and was just intrigued by this guy. He was like, right out of Boston politics and
Yeah, I
knew
knew him
all
too.
the Kennedys and all that. He was great. But he railed on, and this was kind of a theme that the neoliberals that Nick was part of at Washington Monthly and Charlie Peters harped on. But that we should bring back the draft or compulsory national service for those who are conscientious objectors. But that having our wars fought by the working class kids has kind of given us J.D. Vance, right? That his message is appealing. Small town people, we got screwed on the economy, the jobs went away, and you sent us off to endless forever wars. And so I think that the military is an interesting thing to discuss in our class. But yeah, the religion is another way in which I think. By and large, our generation's failure to participate kind of helped accelerate this growing distrust and lack of social cohesion and just a general skepticism about experts and those people Nick was talking about that going back to Plato, where the elite's supposed to help manage the
Mhm.
society. A lot of distrust because there's a perception that you're not really looking out for me and my best interest. You're only lining your own pocket.
There's another element here is geography, where if you look at any of the data, and this is global, this isn't just the U.S. There's, the metro areas that are, quote unquote blue, and the rural areas that are quote unquote red, and a lot of the polarization is geographically along those lines. Now, where that pertains to us is if you look in the back of our little alumni reunion book and see where people live. Um, there's this term that people use to talk about all this called the funnel effect. So Harvard does this great job of finding people from all over the country who are good at all sorts of things, and then they bring them to Harvard, and then they funnel them into, you know, the Bay Area, the New York area, the Boston, greater Boston area, LA, Chicago, and, very heavy concentration in half a dozen fields of endeavor.
Mhm.
And so, there it is. So they're part of, um, that group that gets so resented and that is perceived as having left everybody else behind.
Did we all have draft numbers?
I did,
Yes.
I did
but
too.
we didn't get drafted.
They
We didn't
suspended
get
the draft.
Do you
Yeah.
I
remember
was
your
number
draft?
6.
Oh my goodness. How about you, Bob?
I had a high number, and what's really weird is I've looked it up before, but I still can't remember it, and that sort of signals that we were the lucky cohort
Yeah.
where it stopped being a draft.
Yeah,
That
they gave us a lottery, but they didn't draft us.
that's what I'm driving at, because we might have even been the last people to get numbers.
Yeah, I
Uh,
think so.
or at least among the last. I had a high number too, but even Nick, I'm assuming when you got number 6, you weren't worried because it was no longer a death sentence. You're no longer going to Vietnam, and
I
you know,
actually was worried
were
because it
you?
wasn't clear that we wouldn't be drafted, and I applied for conscientious objector status.
Oh wow.
And my local draft board wrote me back and said, "We don't think you're sincere. We think you just don't want to serve," which, of course, nothing could be further from the truth. Um, but then after that, it was announced that we were never going to be drafted.
So here's my question on this is that because number one, we're super lucky, right?
Yeah.
That we missed that. We're just incredibly lucky. We missed it by the skin of our teeth, right? But we forget that. We
Yeah,
forget that.
absolutely.
But I think that maybe, and I'm just guessing here, but maybe compared to our fathers, my father was a war correspondent, but he was in every war. He was the oldest war correspondent in Korea, for crying out loud. He was in Vietnam. You couldn't keep him away. And he loved the army. He loved this. He loved the army and the people who served in the army. And I think that war, big wars like we've been through as a country, not the more recent ones, but there's a common purpose there that's obvious, right? We're all in this together. The enlisted men are from all kinds of places. There's stratification and hierarchy, but basically, it's a flattening of the curve, right? Where there, it's sort of it's not a meritocracy per se, but it's supposed to be. So I'm wondering about the fact that we missed that. We might have missed something really important that came with that, which is just identifying with less lucky, less privileged, more normal and average people from, pardon the expression, all walks of life. Maybe that's part of this.
Completely agree. I completely agree with that. It's you grow up maybe in a bubble and then you enter the bubble even more at Harvard. And,
Yeah.
Harvard is wonderfully diverse in a lot of ways, but not really in the way we're talking about.
Yeah. So, Bob, what are your thoughts on that? Do you think that were your parents was your father military? Had he served? I think you said he had, right? Your
No,
dad.
he was turned down for his vision, and so he had the uh, I don't want to say humiliating, but challenging experience of going to college during the war, where at the Baylor University campus, which was a very important Baptist school in my family's history, he was, that it was like we talk about 4-to-1 male to female at the merger of Harvard and Radcliffe initially, but it was something like 8-to-1 female to male when he was there. But anyway, he.
And that
I
was
think
because of the war. That was because of the war.
the war, exactly. The guys were gone. And so my dad was president of his centennial class at Baylor. which, given the fact that a lot of the guys were off at war, it might have been easier to achieve that. But I think as a
Mm.
result of that, he was absolutely fastidious, I think, through the rest of his life about being involved in civic groups, Rotary Club. He really wanted. He was very conscious of not coming off as an elitist egghead, but a servant of people, and very aware that his salary was paid by people who voluntarily put money in an offering plate. So
So instead of the military experience, we grew up, we're children of the 60s, our class. And I put you, I don't know if you would agree with this, but I start the 60s with the Beatles on the Ed Sullivan Show, and I ended with the last helicopter going out of Saigon. To me, that's the 60s.
when we were
Um,
in college.
Before that, yeah, right. Before that, early 60s, that's the 50s. If you remember, that was the 50s. Anyhow, what I'm really wondering is, and I want to ask you both as journalists. So I remember how kind of surprised and flummoxed I was when I heard the phrase mainstream media, because we're all media people. And I was like, I was just out there like trying to do a good job. I was just trying to find out what happened. I don't, I guess I had an agenda, but, it's not something I was ever consciously thinking about. But yet that, the liberal media, the mainstream media is kind of an interchangeable, right?
Mhm.
So Nick, you were dean of the Columbia School of Journalism, probably some through part of this period at least. Um, I'm wondering if you and Bob were surprised by this, and also whether this served to, it inherently was an elite, it was a priesthood
Yeah,
of
so a
journalism.
couple things about this. In the broader context, this just needs to be said given what we're talking about. We grew up in a very heavily regulated economy that
Mhm.
either caused or was coincident with a much flatter income distribution curve. And at least when I was young, I think I thought, boy, what a stupid idea having a regulated economy. We need to deregulate the economy. And we did in many fields, and
Mhm.
that helped fuel inequalities growth, although it also fueled market dynamism and all that. Now, I'm putting media in that context because we also grew up in a very regulated media environment where, particularly in broadcast, I mean, because of the way things evolved, most big cities had one monopoly newspaper. At the beginning of the 20th century, they had 8, 10 fiercely competing dailies. And then, there were 3 licensed broadcast networks with affiliates in cities. Even public broadcasting was brand new when we came along. And so there was the idea that, some of us get a little nostalgic for those days, but
Ah,
that was,
Monopoly. It was so great back then, as long as you had a job.
but it was, that was a very stable world. And we decided we wanted a more unregulated media environment, first with cable, then on steroids with the internet. So now we have a world where anybody can say whatever they want and publish to a
Don't,
global audience.
Sorry to interrupt, but don't forget the fairness doctrine, which opened
Yeah,
up
that's all. Yeah, that's all part of it is the
huge,
deregulation of
huge.
broadcast,
Yeah,
and and um,
yeah.
and anybody can publish, anybody can receive anything. When I was growing up in Louisiana, first of all, it was very clear already that conservatives hated the media and saw the media as liberal. Remember that in the 1964 San Francisco convention, uh, the Goldwater delegates spat at the press people in the press box. And when I was growing up, I don't know if this was true of you, Bob, you'd go to your friends' houses and there'd be these kind of like mimeograph publications that were, against civil rights and stuff like that. They were sort of like came out of somewhere. They were informal, super right wing publications that people, a lot of my friends' parents like to read.
Hmm.
Um, so that was always a kind of slumbering giant. And, also, I was working in the Washington Post newsroom in 1980, then on election night when Ronald Reagan won.
Hmm.
You know, speaking out of school, maybe the newsroom was not real happy that Reagan won the election, and it was unmistakable, and was surprised that Reagan had won the election.
Hmm.
And it was very rare in the hundreds of people working there to find people who even knew Reagan voters.
In fact, it wasn't
Conservatism.
a landslide. It was like not even close.
Yeah, but we thought the conservatism died with Goldwater's failed 1964 campaign, and we as journalists just missed and have missed consistently how many conservatives there are out there in this country. So I don't think the idea of the liberal media is a myth. And because now I work in a university, what I'm more around is people on the left who hate the liberal media for being too right wing. My students almost always think the New York
Is
Times
that
is,
right? Is that
yeah,
right?
they think the New York Times is super right wing. Um, so, it's hard if you have like one delimited media space, no, no matter how carefully it's done. It's hard for everybody to say, "Oh, they got it right."
Yeah. And Bob, how did you react when you heard the phrase mainstream media? Were you like, that's me, or what are they talking about?
AKA lamestream media, by the way.
Yeah. What Rush called it, Rush Limbaugh. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, Nick knows this. It's weird because while I grew up in a very self-consciously southern state, Kentucky, I was in a media bubble growing up in Louisville where the family that owned it, the Binghams, and their name is on part of North House at Radcliffe. They were very liberal and ran very advanced two newspapers and a TV station and a 50,000 watt AM radio station. And when I grew up, there was a lot of Goldwater type insurgents who could not stand the Binghams and everything they represented. And so it was an interesting, you know, probably a little blue bubble before we even used the color blue and the color red to mark parties. But that misled a lot of us about how conservative Kentucky was really trending in these years that Nick is talking about. I well remember some of my neighborhood boys that I ran with, their parents having, cans of AUH2O, Goldwater soft drinks and all that. And I was, my parents were Texans and, anyway, LBJ was their favorite in that race. But that's one of the last times my dad voted Democratic in a presidential election. But anyway,
Yeah.
so I one other point though I wanted to make about getting back to the larger point Nick was making about Harvard being a ticket to a life of ease in recent decades was that I had been in kind of a pre-law track until I got involved in my high school newspaper, and some stuff happened that, I had some editorials that my teacher, great English teacher named Catherine Kerwin, was the advisor to the student newspaper, and she had friends at the Bingham Media Empire and got some of my editorials reprinted in the afternoon paper, the Louisville Times, and that was it. After I'd been in print, it was like crack cocaine. There was no turning back the law. But another part of that was some of the guys I got to know and admired who were liberal and wanting social change and stuff, who were ahead of me at Harvard, who went on to law school while I was in Harvard undergraduate. I could see a change in them, and we were undergoing a sea change while we were at Harvard of the rise of, a concern about the economy and getting a good job, and the rise of the Republican Club. And so for me, going into journalism was almost like a vow of poverty I was taking, because I could see the change in their attitude of my friends. After a couple of years of law school, they were like, they were no longer talking about going to Appalachia or being a Vista volunteer or Peace Corps. They were talking about paying off their loans and settling down and getting a nest egg.
Making some real
Yeah, and
money.
remember the old Harvard, Yale, et cetera, that were more quote unquote aristo, they didn't need loans, right?
Right.
They could
Yeah,
major in English and history and so on. But the
yeah,
more diverse Harvard became, the more, like if mom and dad own a dry cleaner in Elmhurst, Queens, they're not going to be saying, I'm begging you, please major in art history, you know? Um,
no,
so,
so
so
true, so true. Um, for the record, I wanted Nick. You brought up all the consolidation of the media. My dad was editor of the World Journal Tribune, and when it folded in 1967, it was the culmination of, I think, 13 newspapers had merged
yeah,
ultimately.
that's why it had that
And
long name.
yeah, that's why it had the wrong. It was called the widget. But what strikes me about what I'm hearing is, Nick, I know you're kind of a sociologist, aren't you? You write books that really try.
Self-appointed sociologist.
Yeah, yeah, that's fine. But I'm struck by what you said about inequality, and I think maybe this is the root of the matter. Actually, Joel Feldman, one of our classmates, is visiting me right now. He's from Duquesne, Pennsylvania, outside Pittsburgh, and he was just talking about how every male, let's say, who grew up in or women too, who grew up in Duquesne, knew they were going to work at the mill, and they were going to work at the steel mill. They were going to make a living wage. They were going to be able to buy a house, and they were going to get health care and maybe even a pension, right? And that went away. And the other thing, the overriding American myth to me has always been, Horatio Alger, where if you work hard, pluck and luck, right? You work hard, do a good job, you'll get ahead. There's overwhelming statistical evidence that that's not true anymore. That if you start here, you end here. If you start here, you end here. And that has literally happened to me. I am literally where I started in my life in many ways. So my question is, what how did that happen? How did this crazy income disparity happen? And I'm also interested in, like, what we could have done, if anything, to change that trajectory. Because to me, that's sort of like inflammation in the human body. It's the root cause of a dozen diseases,
Yeah.
and I'm
Well,
just wondering about that.
so first of all, on mobility, it's worth, here I'm being the self-appointed sociologist again,
Thank you. We need one.
dividing it into categories. Is mobility what you would call mass mobility, where everybody is moving up at once? Or is mobility a situation where a few people can get into the elite, but it doesn't show up statistically, but it shows up anecdotally? Or is it a system where everybody sort of, the structure stays the same, but there's some recirculation going on? So people who start at the bottom end up at the top, et cetera. By far, the preferable system is a mass mobility system. So
Hmm.
let's go back to Joel Feldman. This is at least my theory about this is, the New Deal happened. And then after the New Deal, Truman tried to create a sort of next level social democracy of the kind you'd find in Germany or England. And it didn't really work. The country was turning conservative. So where we ended up was a kind of corporate welfare state. The people Joel is talking about, they tended to work for, like, let's say, U.S. Steel.
Hmm.
So U.S. Steel would have been a stable company that uh, was unionized, and where people with blue collar and white collar felt that they could work there with sort of de facto tenure unless they really screwed up for their whole life. And then they'd retire with a in many cases defined benefit pension. And that world just blew up in the 70s and 80s. And I think that, it's not as fully appreciated as it should be. And it's really, really important. I moved to Westchester County, New York, in 1986, 40 years ago. And it was starting then. And, this was the headquarters of IBM. And, there'd be these signs you'd see on churches, like every Wednesday night, we're having a meeting, a support group for laid off IBM white collar employees. And
Mm.
these are people, like I would meet them sometimes, they didn't know what hit them, you know? And we've
Well,
seen that in
particularly
the
IBM,
newspaper.
which had a no layoff policy for its entire
Yeah,
course of
right.
history. Yeah.
Yeah, it
Yeah.
was like you wear a white shirt to every day. You put that little sign that says "Think" on your desk, and you get transferred every 2 years, and you salute. Same with General Electric, and then you retire at 65 and get your.
IBM stood for I've been moved, I
Yeah,
believe.
right,
Yeah.
exactly.
Yeah.
And that was a social compact that took in not the whole country, but a lot of the country, and it had a white collar component and a blue collar component, and that just went away for a bunch of reasons. And I think, and there wasn't a sort of more iterated welfare state to sort of catch people, and so you wound up with a much more kind of a society that where people had very different economic fates. It wasn't so evened out, and I think that's really, really important.
Bob, did you see that in Texas and in Kentucky as you were? Do you have any sense this is what was unfolding at a higher level?
Yeah, in Louisville, my hometown, I mean, there was a GE appliance park. There was DuPont, and Rubbertown was a heavily polluted, lower income area. There were Philip Morris and Brown and Williamson cigarette factories. All of these were unionized. In my youth, the big wrangle of the civic elite was about whether we had become known as Strike City, and we needed to have a right to work law so we could like catch up with Atlanta, which was spurting past cities like Louisville. And then,
Mm.
yeah, I one summer had a job selling driveways and went into blue collar neighborhoods and was, where there was the bass boat and two cars, and all these guys could, without anything more than a high school education, have a ticket to the middle class with these jobs. And it was already evaporating. But
Trump really tapped into that
yeah.
big
So,
time.
so what I wanted to ask about this is what could we and I mean as a country, what could we have done differently? Because we're the priests of the liberal elite, blamed for a lot of this, or blamed for ignoring what Nick and you are describing, Bob. About what was happening, like not caring, just ignoring it to the degree that voters voted with their feet and decided like the hell with these liberals. We're going in another direction. Is there anything then and now that could kind of change the course of history? Because
Let
it's
me
creating.
throw in one thing before that we
Yeah,
answer,
please,
which
please.
is Bernie Sanders, because
Yeah.
that's important. So there was a really big right populist revolt, and then there was a not quite as big but big left socialist revolt.
Yeah.
Occupy
Both
Wall
of them,
Street. Yeah.
Yeah.
yeah, totally unexpected. So I mean, the extreme example is Britain, where the two traditional parties are both dying. Not so true here, but it came at the elite, which of course none of us are in. Uh, but let's say we could say us from both directions, not just one direction, more from the right than from the left. But then Bob will answer what we could have done.
Well done. Well done.
I think it gets to the question, Mike, of why would it have been important for more of the educated, highly educated elites to be participating in religious institutions? And I think the answers I come up with are like humility, um, a correct understanding of human nature and what are the limitations of social reform movements. Not ceding this whole space that Donald Trump has seized on common sense, like just having your feet on the ground, being aware of who's been paying the freight or paying the price to keep the society going. And, you know, I don't know that any of this would have made a difference if more of us had stayed in churches or been at least a little more humble in our attitudes. But and it, in my practice in the media, I I through 47 and a half years as a reporter saw the complete dissolution of people having any kind of respect or trust. It increasingly became suspicion, and can you verify that? And we had perhaps been too arrogant. Like, I'm going to tell you what you need to know, was sort of our attitude back in the 70s. Um, and it was good in some ways that we were sort of forced to like show our papers, like, that whole movement to like footnote your stories, where every document or every, prove that you did all this stuff, these people were real. um, but
Jim
anyway,
Cook.
those would be sort of my half-assed answers.
So we just have a couple minutes left, but I'd wanted to maybe ask each of you to just take a moment and and think about whether you personally would have done things differently in your careers, in your even in your lives, had you known we would arrive at this place right now, right? So had you known this is where we were heading, would you have done anything differently? Bob, I'll let you go first.
Boy, that's a tough one. I I might want to replay a few things there, but part of my journalism career was really sort of a search for personal identity. Knowing the places I came from, and I don't know that I would have changed that. I mean, I never went off to become a foreign correspondent or play on a national stage the way Nick did. Um, Whether I could have done anything to halt what we're talking about, I'm not sure.
Yeah, fair enough. Nick?
I don't have tons of regrets, but I do think, we've been sort of loosely using this term neoliberalism. I'm a reformed neoliberal, I would say.
Mhm.
And I regret my enthusiasm about destructuring and deregulating every aspect of the economy back when it was happening in the 70s and 80s,
Yeah.
not seeing what the consequences would be. And I also, by the time Reagan got elected, which is pretty early, I had woken up to this more. But at first, I just thought you can completely ignore conservative politics. It's finished. And that was a mistake in covering
And
America.
and just one last thing about that to follow up on that, Nick. I I had the same reaction, but it was after Obama got elected. I was like, oh, thank God we can stop fighting these freaking battles and really get somewhere as a country. And I could not have been more wrong,
Yeah.
right?
Yep. Yeah.
I mean, it just was
Yeah.
100%
I mean,
wrong.
I think in the more recent times, the big kahuna event of many was the 2008 financial crisis. And, I live in New York, and you really didn't see it here because we're the town of finance, and finance got bailed out. So,
Yeah.
by October, November, you couldn't get a reservation at a restaurant again. And then, I went out to do a story for the New Yorker in Las Vegas. And I just thought, oh my God, because you go to entire neighborhoods that were just, it was like going to New Orleans, my hometown, after Hurricane Katrina, except there hadn't been a natural disaster. It was empty. Nobody would be there, you know? And I just thought this is a much, much, much bigger deal than I first realized in terms of changing the whole mood of the country.
Well, listen, I want to thank you both, Bob Garrett, the stellar State House and government reporter and columnist for both in Louisville and in Texas, most recently with the Dallas Morning News. I'm not going to call you retired, Bob, because I know you're doing a lot of writing and you're still in the midst. Nick Lemann is the dean of the Columbia University School of Journalism, or was the dean, and is still a professor, right? You're still teaching.
Right. I'm not retired from being a professor or a journalist, but I am retired from being a dean. So
So from being a dean, yeah. And Nick, I wanted to mention before we left that you and I have something very special in common, which is we have both dedicated books to Alan Brinkley.
Oh, I sure did. I plead guilty of that. Very
Yeah,
much
I
so.
don't know, Bob, if you knew Alan Brinkley. The late Alan Brinkley became provost of Columbia University, but was
Yeah, he was my boss.
I
he was
worked
your
with
boss.
his younger brother Joel at the Louisville Courier Journal.
Oh,
Yeah.
okay. So Alan, died. Nick, what was the book you dedicated to Alan?
It was the book about all these economic things we've been talking about called Transaction Man, in 2019. And Alan was still alive then, but
There you
yes,
go.
there you
Great.
go. But
Excellent.
not very. He had a very sad end.
I know he was very, very sick. And I wrote a book called Write Good 36 Writing Rules Made to Be Broken. And I dedicated, you'll probably appreciate this, Nick, to Alan Brinkley and Gordon Lish.
And I know Gordon Lish too. He was my sister's editor.
Yeah,
So
yeah, yeah. Small world.
Yeah.
But listen, this has been great, Bob. Terrific idea. Thank you so much. And I think we can do more of things like this, where we're kind of tackle something rather than just navel gaze.
yeah.
Yeah. Thanks for. I think you may have found a new format, maybe a way this can continue beyond us a little bit. But
Well, thanks for your receptivity.
Thanks a lot.
Yeah,
This is great.
Absolutely, thanks. And I used to end these by saying "see you at reunion," and I've decided I'm going to say the same thing. See you at reunion.
Right. 60th.
All right, thanks.
Fingers crossed.
Bye bye now.